George Harrison, often seen as the quiet and introspective member of the Beatles, carried a sense of bitterness that was hidden beneath his calm exterior. His unspoken grievances were never loud or public, but they were always real and deeply personal. From the early days of the Beatles, Harrison struggled with being overshadowed by the more dominant personalities of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. As the band rose to unprecedented fame, George, although immensely talented, often felt sidelined in both the studio and in the public eye. His musical contributions were frequently overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney's dominance in both songwriting and studio control. Despite his vast potential, George felt that his voice, both literally and metaphorically, was often dismissed, leading to years of internal conflict. Feeling overlooked. The price of fame and control. As the Beatles reached their zenith in the 1960s, George Harrison earned the nickname the Quiet Beatle. On the surface, this image of a meditative, introverted figure was romanticized by the press. Yet, to those who knew him, it spoke to a much deeper frustration. George wasn't just quiet, he was often sidelined and ignored. His musical ideas and spiritual awakenings, while deeply personal and meaningful, didn't always find room in the studio. When he proposed songs, they were often dismissed or passed over. His guitar arrangements were second-guessed, and his contributions felt less valued than those of Lennon and McCartney. This growing sense of frustration began to evolve into something more akin to resentment, particularly toward Paul, whose perfectionism and dominating personality would leave George feeling creatively stifled. The breaking point: tension. During the White Album sessions. By the time the Beatles were recording the White Album in 1968, the band dynamic had shifted. George Harrison was no longer the quiet contributor. He had grown in both confidence and ambition. But in the studio, he still felt unheard. The tension between him and Paul McCartney reached its peak during the sessions for Let It Be in 1969. McCartney's perfectionism and tendency to micromanage began to push Harrison to his limits. In one infamous incident, Paul attempted to direct George's guitar part on the song Two of Us. George, frustrated by the constant interference, responded with a calm yet pointed remark: "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." This moment, captured on tape, was more than just a minor disagreement. It symbolized years of pent-up frustration and artistic suffocation that had built up over time. George Harrison's temporary departure. A turning point. The frustration between George and Paul continued to build, culminating in George's temporary departure from the Beatles in January 1969. Tensions had reached a breaking point, and George felt that he could no longer be part of a group where his contributions were consistently dismissed. McCartney, although not intentionally cruel, was often controlling, and George had grown tired of being pushed aside. When George returned to the band shortly after, he did so on his own terms, determined to assert his own artistic voice. During this period, he wrote some of his most beloved songs, including Something and Here Comes the Sun, proving what he was capable of when allowed the freedom to create on his own terms. However, the damage had been done, and the rift between him and Paul had deepened, leading to a permanent shift in their relationship. The Beatles breakup. George's emotional separation. The Beatles officially dissolved in 1970, but for George Harrison, the split wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. While the media focused on the public feud between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, George quietly withdrew from the group emotionally. The years of frustration and unspoken resentment had taken their toll, particularly in his relationship with Paul. In 1971, George released All Things Must Pass, a solo album filled with songs that had been previously sidelined or rejected by the Beatles. The album was a commercial and critical success, and the track Wah Wah was widely interpreted as a thinly veiled commentary on the emotional noise and frustration George had endured within the band. The bitterness that had been building for years was now laid bare in his music. Paul McCartney and the Legal Battle, a betrayal of trust. George's bitterness toward Paul McCartney only intensified during the legal battles that followed the Beatles' breakup. When McCartney filed a lawsuit to dissolve the band's business partnership, George saw it not only as a legal necessity, but as a betrayal. The lawsuit marked a final break between them, cementing the growing emotional distance that had been festering for years. George's frustration with Paul's controlling nature was evident in his music, especially in songs like Sue Me, Sue You Blues from 1973. Although the song was a broader commentary on the legal fallout, it was clear that much of George's anger was aimed at McCartney. His ex-wife, Pattie Boyd, later confirmed that George had never fully liked Paul's personality, describing how the constant arguments, particularly with Paul, had affected George emotionally. The Beatles reunite. Old dynamics resurface. In 1994, the Beatles' surviving members reunited to work on the anthology project, marking the first time in decades that George, Paul, and Ringo Starr were in the same room together to complete some of John Lennon's unfinished demos. For fans, this reunion was seen as a moment of healing, but insiders quickly noticed that old dynamics resurfaced. George was still visibly frustrated by Paul's domineering presence, and in private, he would often roll his eyes at Paul's suggestions. When asked about working with McCartney again, George quipped, "It was like going back to school," highlighting the tension that still lingered between them. Despite the outwardly cordial atmosphere, it was clear that George and Paul's relationship had never fully healed, and their creative partnership was still fraught with unspoken tension. George Harrison's legacy, resignation, and reflection. As the 1990s progressed, George Harrison had largely stepped out of the Beatles' shadow, establishing himself as a respected solo artist and a spiritual thinker. However, the emotional scars from his time with the band still lingered. George rarely spoke about the Beatles unless directly asked, and when he did, his tone was dry and reflective. He didn't romanticize the past. Instead, he offered his version of the truth, one that acknowledged the deep emotional pain he experienced during his time with the band. In one interview, when asked if he missed being in the Beatles, George responded, "Not with the others, no." This remark, while seemingly lighthearted, revealed just how deep the wounds went. For George, the Beatles were a part of his past that he could never fully reconcile. The final goodbye. George Harrison's last words. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, at a friend's home in Los Angeles, surrounded by loved ones. His final words, according to his wife Olivia, were simple but profound. Love one another. This parting message, though poignant, also reflected the complexity of his relationships, particularly with Paul McCartney. Despite the years of tension, their final meeting was a quiet, personal one. Paul later described how they sat together holding hands, a gesture that neither would have made in their younger years. Though George's death marked the end of an era, it also highlighted the deep emotional wounds that never fully healed. While Paul grieved publicly, the unspoken tension between them remained, a reminder of the unresolved issues that had plagued their relationship for decades. Conclusion: George Harrison's lasting impact. In the end, George Harrison left behind a legacy that transcended his time with the Beatles. His music, spiritual journey, and quiet rebellion continue to inspire generations. Though he was never the loudest Beatle, his pain, silence, and resilience spoke volumes. Through it all, George Harrison remained true to himself, carving out his own path in music and life. His relationship with Paul McCartney may have been filled with unresolved tension, but it was also a testament to the complexities of friendship, creativity, and the human spirit.